Okay, thanks, Kevin. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to this public event on Gulf-Israel relations, and it's hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Clemens Chay, and I will act as moderator for this event that will be recorded. The cultivation of bilateral ties between the Gulf states and Israel, with the exception of Kuwait, which we will talk about later, has been an open secret. And to the extent that one Middle East commentator, Ian Black, calls these relations just below the surface. He alludes to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's remarks on September 2017, when he told Israeli diplomats at the Foreign Ministry, and I quote, "What is happening in practice with Arab states has never happened in our history, even when we signed peace agreements. And in practice, cooperation in different ways and at different levels isn't necessarily visible above the surface, but what is below the surface is far greater than at any period in Israel's victory. It is a huge change," unquote. So alongside cooperative initiatives are high-profile state visits, including Netanyahu's visit to Oman in October 2018 for talks with Sultan Qaboos, the late Sultan Qaboos, accompanied by the head of the Mossad. So more recently, of course, the UAE became the first Gulf state and the third Arab state behind Egypt and Jordan to recognize and fully normalize relations with Israel. The UAE-Israel deal, also known as the Abraham Accord, makes today's discussion more timely than ever. Not only because it marks the establishment of overt diplomatic relations, but also because of the implications the deal has for the Gulf, Arab public opinion in general, and the remaining solutions for the Palestinians, among others. So today, we are delighted to have with us a stellar list of speakers who are joining us from very different time zones. Please allow me to introduce our four speakers. First, Mr. Sigurd Neubauer. He's a Gulf analyst and commentator. Welcome, Mr. Sigurd. He is the author of The Gulf Region and Israel, Old Struggles, New Alliances by Kodesh Press 2020, recently released. And he's the co-editor of The Gulf Crisis, Reshaping Alliance in the Middle East, published by the Gulf International Forum in 2018. His decades-long research experience focuses on US Gulf relations, including the Gulf states, intra-Gulf dynamics, Gulf-Israeli relations, and these span from the US Defense Ministry, US defense industry to Washington think tanks and Arab media. He's also authored dozens of scholarly articles and hundreds of commentary pieces, including for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, CNN, Fox News, so on and so forth. From 2019 to 2018, Mr. Neubauer was a senior analyst for SOS International, a US defense consultancy. So we welcome him on board the panel today. And we also have with us today, Dr. Abdullah Babood, who was my former colleague. He recently took up the position of visiting professor at the School of International and Liberal Studies at Waseda University, Japan. He was previously a visiting research professor here with us at the MEI. And he also held the positions of director at both the Gulf Research Center at the University of Cambridge and at the Gulf Study Center in Qatar University. His research interests are primarily focused on the Gulf states, their economic, social, and political development. So welcome, Dr. Abdullah Babood. Good to see you again. Also with us today is Dr. Shafiq Khabra. He's joining us from Washington, DC. He's a professor of political science at Kuwait University and the founding president of Jusur Arabiya, which focuses on youth leadership programs and strategic planning. He is the former founding president of the American University of Kuwait. He also directed the Kuwait Information Office in Washington, DC, and the Center of Strategic Studies at Kuwait University. Dr. Khabra earned his BA from Georgetown, his MA from Purdue, University and his PhD in political science from the University of Texas at Austin in 1987. He is the author of 5 books and numerous studies. And our fourth speaker is Rabbi David Rawson. Pleased to have you on board. He is the International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee. He is concurrently a member of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel's Committee for Interreligious Dialogue and serves also on the Council of the Religious Institutions of the Holy Land. He holds positions in various organizations, including as the International President of the World Conference on Religion and Peace, Honorary President of the International Council of Christians and Jews, and as the only Jewish member of the Board of Directors of the King Abdullah International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue, established in 2012 by the King of Saudi Arabia, together with the governments of Austria and Spain with the support of the Holy See. So very glad to have all of you on board. Before we begin, a few house rules on the format of the event proceedings. Each speaker will have the opening remarks of a maximum of 10 minutes, following which the other panelists can jump in to respond briefly. And after all the speakers have delivered their 10-minute statements, we will start taking questions from the floor. For the audience, it's a pleasure to have you today with us. Please remain muted and have your video switched off so the focus will be on our speakers. You are welcome to participate in the Q&A by sending your questions through via the Zoom chat box. So without further ado, let us kick off with Mr. Sigurd Neubauer. Welcome, Sigurd. Your book was recently published almost a month ago with an interesting title to characterize Gulf-Israel relations. You call it Old Struggles, New Alliances. If you could run us through why there is an increasing cultivation of ties, and in light of the UAE-Israel deal, does this signify a strategic shift in Israel's relations with the Gulf? That's the first question. How can we see also in the narratives that have been promoted, such as the Gulf-Israel alliance against Iran? And on that note, based on the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, what can we expect from the kingdom? Of course, the latest is that Prince Turki Al Faisal says that there is no normalization without a Palestinian state. And that's also echoed by King Salman just yesterday, who told President Donald Trump that he wants a fair and permanent solution for the Palestinians. So over to you, Sigurd.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with all of you today. And the discussion is certainly timely. Let me just tell you quickly about my own book and why the title that I chose, because the public narrative has been over many years, and especially since Donald Trump became president, that there is a Gulf-Israel alliance against Iran. That has been a narrative that has been promoted by the Israeli Prime Minister, and it is a narrative that has been adopted, if you will, by the Trump administration. And why I think it's really important to understand, and this is a key plank of my book, is that Gulf-Israel relations are not necessarily motivated by Iran, but rather by inter-Gulf Arab rivalry and how it plays out in Washington. And the Gulf crisis, namely the Qatar crisis, is a primary example of that. That is something that I will discuss later in my prepared remarks. But what I think is important to understand is that Gulf-Israel relations did not start in 2016. Gulf-Israel relations go back a very long time. And what we are seeing during the Trump presidency is that we have seen the emergence of all the Arabian struggles really hitting the surface, bubbling up throughout the surface. And that's why I call my book Old Struggles, New Alliances, because the struggles between Qatar and its neighbors, that's a struggle that go back a long time. And the struggles between Oman and UAE and Saudi Arabia also struggles that go back a long time. As a matter of fact, in the 1950s, Britain intervened to prevent a full-scale war between Oman and Saudi Arabia over southern Yemen and among other issues. So we're seeing these tensions flare up again, and we're seeing that Israel, contrary again to the public narrative, is playing a stabilizing role within the broader Gulf region. The Israeli narrative, as I mentioned, is of course that Iran is its #1 strategic threat, but what we're seeing is that the inter-Arab disputes have dragged Israel in to the conflict to the level that is only starting to be publicly known at this moment in time. So this is my first point. My second point is when we look at the strategic alignment of the Gulf region, I would like to point out that Israel's elevated standing in the Gulf, if you will, is really driven by chaos in Washington and by a unpredictable American president whose administration has made ties between Israel and the Gulf states contingent upon how the various Gulf states interact with Israel. And that in itself has elevated Israel's standing and has also enabled Israel to put a lid on some of these inter-Arabian struggles and preventing them really from becoming hot conflicts. The case in point is not just the crisis between Qatar and its neighbors. One of the key planks of my book is that Israel became a peacemaker, and Israel, along with Turkey and Iran, played an increasingly important role to prevent that conflict from becoming a hot conflict. And I'll be happy to go into details later on. The second point, I think, which is not fully understood yet, is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's historic visit to Muscat was certainly framed publicly as Omani support for relaunching direct talks between Israel and the Palestinians. But in reality, it was a Israeli decision to shore up support for Sultan Qaboos and his government as Muscat faced an extraordinary difficult crisis with its own neighbor, the United Arab Emirates. And the Mossad director's subsequent visit to Muscat was to illustrate that ties between Oman and Israel are longstanding and robust. Speaking of which, the ties between Oman and Israel are not only strategic in nature, they are quite frankly historic. We know that the first engagement between Israel and Oman started in the 1970s when the Mossad, along with Iran and Jordan, provided support for Sultan Qaboos in the civil war against the Dhofar rebellion in southern Yemen. At that point, Israel provided military and technical and military assistance to Qaboos, and some of the introduction between Oman and Qaboos was facilitated by the British. So that the relationship really goes back a long time, and it is also important to understand that Oman has really up until recently been very discreet with its relationship with Israel, and it was only after the Gulf crisis hit Washington, in which Israel became front and center in the struggle between Qatar on one hand and the blockading states, that Oman decided, so to speak, last minute to invite Prime Minister Netanyahu to ensure that the kind of pressure that Qatar had come under from its neighbors would not come to Oman. So this is important. The second thing I think is important to understand is that the timing of the UAE-Israel peace agreement is significant, because it can be argued that during the Gulf crisis in 2017, when the blockading states came to President Trump and requested his support for their blockade, it can be argued that the narrow focus or the exclusive focus on Qatar Hamas ties was deliberate rhetoric by the United Arab Emirates and its surrogates in the United States to drag Israel into this inter-Arabian struggle. And at that time, it can be argued, and I don't know for sure, but it can be argued that the United Arab Emirates may very well have offered Israel full diplomatic relations in exchange for supporting it in its struggle against Qatar. If that offer was extended at that time, we don't know. But if it was, Israel did not take it. Instead, Israel actually extended Qatar a hand in peace and accelerated reconstruction in Gaza as a way of providing Qatar with a face-saving measure, where Qatar could argue that it was not supporting Hamas, but in fact cooperating with the Jewish state. So this is an important point. The second point of the timing of the UAE-Israel agreement is that it arrives at a time when Oman-Israel relations are steady and strong, even though there are public indications, and I'm sure our colleague Abdullah Baboud will discuss this, that there are indications that Oman will not follow through with normalization with Israel, as has been discussed in the Israeli media. And the timing of the UAE-Israel normalization agreement also comes at a time where Qatar-Israel relations are flourishing. We just saw last week, as a matter of fact, that Qatar mediated a ceasefire, a long-term ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. And the ceasefire agreement was, of course, praised by the Israeli president, which goes to show that that everybody is satisfied with the current state of Gulf-Israel dynamics. I'd like to point out that because of the timing, it is understood, I think, everywhere in the Gulf, even so reluctantly, that peace between Israel and the United Arab Emirates is not only positive, in my view, but it will not come at the expense of the other Gulf states. So in other words, Israel is acting, in my view, with great responsibility in terms of how it is dealing with each of the Gulf countries and how it is moving forward with its normalization process with the United Arab Emirates, because both in Muscat, perhaps in Kuwait, I'll leave that to our colleague, and certainly in Doha, there is a lot of unease in terms of how the Emirati, Saudi regional agenda is being played. And Israel, of course, is now in the middle of this struggle, but because Israel has played a responsible role in terms of keeping these inter-Arabian struggles in check, I think that there is a cautious optimism that if managed correctly, this peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates will have a positive impact on their own security and on the balance of power in the Gulf. Which leads me to my final point, which is to say that my own read of this is that the agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel was a bilateral agreement, which is to say that for Mohammed bin Zayed, contrary to what many of my colleagues have argued, the timing of this agreement is not necessarily about helping Trump in his re-election campaign, as many have suggested, but rather that Mohammed bin Zayed saw a closing window of opportunity, which is to say that the United Arab Emirates is very aware of its international image, and its international image was facing significant constraints and significant pushback including in the United States, and Mohammed bin Zayed saw normalizing relations with Israel as an opportunity to reinvent himself and reshape the regional narrative. And in that extent, from that point of view, I think that the Israelis helped United Arab Emirates quite significantly, just like they have helped Qatar in its own crisis at its own time. So I think that that's an important aspect to the discussion. And because these dynamics are what is guiding, in my view, the Israel-UAE dynamics, um, we have seen that the other Gulf states, because their own tensions with the United Arab Emirates, do not, quote, want to follow the United Arab Emirates. They want to define their relationship with Israel on their own terms. We have seen now that the public rhetoric and public statements from from Oman, Qatar, certainly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, is that normalization will be tied to a two-state solution and to progress on the Israeli-Palestinian file. And I think that I'm speculating, but I think that until November, there will not be any other additional Arab countries to normalize ties with Israel. Should President Trump be reelected, I think all bets are off. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sigurd. So just to sort of put your comments in summarize your comments. So Israel has a stabilizing role, and all alliances and struggles that you talked about is partly also due to dragging an inter-Arabian struggle by bringing Qatar into the picture, and you got the possibility where Israel is actually there's an Israel versus Qatar in exchange for diplomatic relations with the UAE.
No, I said the opposite.
Okay. Please, can you clarify that point, please?
So what I'm clarifying is that when the inter-Arabian struggle in between Qatar and its neighbors played out in Washington, the objective from the blockading states was to drag Israel into the crisis and get Israel to support their blockade. Instead, we saw the opposite. Israel actually did help Qatar and its dire when it was on its knees, to use the lack of a better metaphor, and help stabilizing the Gulf crisis. And so even though UAE and Qatar are bitter enemies, the Israel-UAE peace agreement is not coming at the expense of Qatar or at the expense of any other Gulf state.
Okay, thank you. Okay, with that, we would like to invite comments from our three panelists. Should we start with Dr. Shafiq? I think you're muted. Okay.
So I have about 10 minutes. You will remind me at the time. I mean, this agreement took the region by surprise. I would not look at it as a positive agreement or a positive development. Given the state of the region, too many conflicts, Iran, Turkey, civil wars, the UAE is involved in so many different complicated issues and conflicts in the region. The Gulf crisis, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. So Israel is coming on a already very heated situation that will now become more heated, given that there is a Turkish base in Qatar. There are American bases in the region. The US seems to be on the way out. So does that mean Israel is on the way in? And yet Israel has a major, bigger problem. I would have wished that Israel would have solved its problem, the main problem with the Palestinian people, before seeking to go in that direction. Because these relations could survive for a while, but they could be short-lived. They could survive with high hopes, but then they could dwindle slowly over time, given the type of changes and developments that we are all seeing in the region. So it's a complicated situation. This agreement didn't have any popular support. You will see a lot of support on Twitter, motivated by certain ministries of interior and Ministry of Information, trolls, different types. It could be a few rooms that is managing hundreds of accounts. But the reality in the street is totally different. People see things differently, to be honest, to be clear, and they still committed to the boycott situation for a very simple reason: occupation of Palestinian land, settlement building in East Jerusalem, as well as in the West Bank, given that there is a consensus on the 1967 borders. This hegemonic attitude, colonial attitude towards the Palestinians, expelling, circulating, siege of Gaza, that situation, I mean, Israeli Jews are 6 million and Palestinians are 6 million. I mean, it's going to be very hard to maintain this status quo down the road, given the type of situation in Palestine. The wall, the sense of discrimination, marginalization, anger, no future, youth, unemployment, refugee camps. It's just not what Ramallah may look like, it's what the rest of Palestine also is experiencing, including Palestinians inside what became Israel in 1948, their territories, their lands, their internal refugees. So there are so many issues. So to run away and jump into the UAE is a smart move, but not extremely smart. It angers. There is a reaction. You see, you have to also look at this region in the context of that the Arab world is also aspiring for democracy, is aspiring for change. This is across the region, by the way. And a leader can make an agreement, but it's not necessarily what's reflected in the region. I understand UAE has a small population, but even in that small population, you will have other opinion, totally different, and yet it cannot be aired due to the repressive situation. Now, when we say the Gulf, it's not anymore the 6 GCC countries that make the Gulf Cooperation Council. So yes, Israel on the one hand came to the UAE. It will be associated more, a bigger state, a strong state, one of the strongest states in the Middle East, one of the most powerful armies, yet dealing with a small state that has an ambitious project that is facing trouble as well in Libya or in Yemen, even in Egypt, even in other areas, and trouble in the crisis with Qatar, because that wasn't, it was a very, it had no logic to start with, and there were no bases for that crisis. But there could have been other motives as well, but it did not work. It failed totally. The siege of Qatar or the boycott of Qatar failed completely, given that Qatar continues, stands out. And yet Kuwait stands out on the other side. It has elections. They're not perfect, working on it. It's in a transitional stage right now, as it is discussing openly more issues of change, representation, redrawing of districts, maybe redrawing of the election. So Kuwait, because it has a more popularly based base, legitimacy is more popular, it is able to say this agreement does not stand. This agreement with the UAE should have been first with the Palestinians. And we've seen agreements with the Egyptians, with the Jordanians, but we've also seen what happens in Jordan. Jordan is very afraid, feels not really stable with the agreement, feels that going around the Palestinian right means destabilizing Jordan at some point. There are those in the Israeli scene that keeps repeating that Jordan is a Palestinian state, which means they have intention to destabilize. So in a way, many people do see the destabilizing aspect of the UAE Israel agreement, and they do see that while this happens, settlements continue. It's 1/3 of the Israeli budget goes to housing, goes 1/3 of it to settlements. There are always announcements on new projects, and that's Palestinian land. Not to say that all of Palestine is Palestinian land, and now it has become Israeli land, and Israel now dominates all of Palestine, and so that conflict will not go away. It will not go away. It will just only takes new shape, new aspects. It may fine, be regulated, less violent, but the stories, the suffering, the marginalization, the agonies, the pains, the sense of exile is very suffocating for Palestinians and for many Arabs who feel their pain as well. No matter what certain autocrats may be telling the Israeli political system, left and right, that does not reflect. Nobody knew Mubarak is going to go suddenly. Nobody knew Gaddafi is going to disappear suddenly. Nobody knew that there will be such a rebellion in Syria. Nobody was able to foresee what will happen. Nobody knew that one day when Israel attacked Lebanon and entered into a package with Lebanon and an agreement with another group in Lebanon, it will end up with Hezbollah. And will end up with a much more radical group even than the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a legitimate national liberation group movement seeking return, seeking its independence and national aspiration. No matter what means it used, like everybody else has used these means, it was also facing the Israeli means, which were far more superior, inflicted more pain and destruction all over the space. So really we need to realize, I mean, I do understand in the early 90s, we've had a process. The process was a peace process and there was a lot of hope. I don't see now at this moment the same hope. I saw the hope in the early 90s, honestly, that when Baker and when Bush put everybody together and there was the Madrid conference and then came Oslo and many people had a sense of optimism regarding that. But then an Israeli prime minister was assassinated in 1995 by an extremist. And from there on, the trust fell down. And also the settlements really never radically, seriously stopped, but then they advanced and advanced and advanced into what the condition of today. Today, Israel is an apartheid state. Now, you may not like that, but it is an apartheid state. You look at this situation, even you look at United Nations resolutions in the last few years, you look at human rights organizations from Israeli human rights all the way to international human rights organization. There is a sense we have entered an apartheid situation, and we have entered a situation where Palestinians are saying, well, you have suffocated the Palestinian state you first committed for, and you agreed to help happen, and it didn't happen, and it doesn't seem it's going to happen, and all the conditions now are taking us into an apartheid situation and a state of resistance to that apartheid. So how will this agreement hold when more demonstrations take place, when Palestinians unite their act? Maybe this is one positive act, actually the most positive of this agreement. It has given the Palestinians a big wake-up call. So if that helps, then yes, it has given them a wake-up call. As a result of that, Hamas and Fatah are speaking. As a result of that, all organizations are speaking. As a result of that, you can see Palestinians taking more, they're recovering, at least I would say, recovering from the end of the second intifada, with all the pain that really happened as a result. You know, the second intifada was a big, it was a war between Israelis and Palestinians, but the pain and the assassinations and the net result was a big loss for the Palestinians. Most of the main middle cadre that participated in that intifada was murdered or killed or assassinated or in prison. And yet the Palestinians are now recovering out of that. And I think they will go back into putting their movement It doesn't necessarily at all mean going back to the military approach. It will still be peaceful. It will still be, but it has to reflect the real pain and the real aspiration and the real need. And it has to look for allies, maybe within Israel, within the Jewish community in the world, within wherever it can, in order to bring about a transformation. But what kind of transformation when this apartheid ends? Would it be one state or would it be two states? The struggle goes on, the stories go on as long as there is pain, there is refugees, there is suffering that has not stopped in terms of property, in terms of existence, in terms of, I mean, the Palestinians at the end of the day were the ones thrown into the sea, thrown into the desert, not the Israelis. They were never really at a threat. And I know there is a narrative in Israel that it was a threat. There was never a threat. Even in 1948, King Abdullah was speaking with them. Even in 1950s, Nasser was trying to speak with them. Even in the early 50s, late 40s, Hosni Zaim in Syria was trying to speak with them. Everybody was trying to speak. And I understand that from state to state relations, but the stories of people and agonies and suffering continues. And without addressing these issues, no peace will stand. And if it does, it is not a real peace, and it will only look a shadowy one that is up to a point. Look at 1994. In the early 90s, there were several offices, one in Qatar, one in the UAE, that really began a consulate for Israel, and there was this exchange. And what happened? There was the Gaza war, and slowly everybody stopped. So we are in a hard time. It's not an easy time for people. Yet, I will tell you, this region is going through transformation. The Corona situation has complicated things much more. And as we get out of Corona, with the economies, with the mismanagement of leaders, and we may have a big change in the White House, and some of those who carry this particular zeal to make these separate small deals at the expense of the real issues, may not be around, and these policies may totally change. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Shafiq. Thank you for confirming that Arab public opinion still regards this Palestinian issue as a very emotive issue, which also raises anger in the general public. But I have two questions really for the rest of the panel before we proceed with the 10 minutes statement by Dr. Abdullah Babood. First, is this Palestinian issue still a priority in terms of national in the list of national priorities? Is the Palestinian issue still a priority? That's the first question. And the second question is there a viable solution now for the Palestinians now that the UAE-Israel deal has penned down the fact that it's going to suspend annexation? So probably we can start with Dr. Abdullah Babood to comment on this before we go around the panel, and then finally go back to your 10-minute. Dr. Babood.
Okay, I thought you were asking the previous speakers. So the questions was, is this, could you repeat that? Sorry,
Is the Palestinian issue still a priority in the list of national interests and priorities? And the second one is there a viable solution for the Palestinians now that the UAE-Israel deal has decided to suspend annexation?
Right. I think there are two different ways of looking at this. First of all, thank you very much, Clemens, for inviting me to this distinguished panel. It's always a pleasure to be with you and personally, and with MEI on MEI events, and also with friends and colleagues in this panel. I guess some of the topics I wanted to talk about has been covered by my colleagues quite eloquently. But just to answer your question is, if you ask me whether the Palestinian issue is still as important as it was, I think the real answer for that, it's not. Because there has been other issues, or there are lots of other issues that have now come on the table, and most of the Arab countries are struggling with these issues, whether it is the pandemic now, but also the economic development, the interstate conflicts, the rivalry and competition between them, etc., and all this kind of reconfiguration of the Middle East. All of these things have become as important as the Palestinian issue. But to say that it has completely gone, I think that will also be wrong, because I think the Palestinian issue is still very much an important issue in the psyche of the people. And that's not because they are just simply Arabs or Muslims or Christians, but because also what they see what is going on is unfair treatment to to the Palestinian people. So it does actually from time to time come up as a strong point in the psyche of the people, and it will not completely die away, but it's not as strong as it used to be in the past. And it depends, of course, on the circumstances. It could go up 1 or 2 points, or it could go down depending on what is going on. Is there a viable solution? Well, it's a very difficult question. I think many people will have different views about this, and I think there has been a lot of attempts at finding a viable solution, whether it's a two-state solution or not, whether it's going to be a one-state solution. It's a very complex situation. I mean, that's what one has to say. It's an extremely complex situation, and trying to just ignore it and think this is it's going to be healed with time, I think that's also difficult, and I think that is wrong. You've got as Shafiq was saying, 6 million Palestinians living in these lands and under conditions that are almost inhuman, difficult in many ways, and living under occupation. They see their lands being annexed all the time, etc. And that is in itself is wrong. And do you want to give them a state where they can aspire to have their own state and their own system, etc., live side by side with Israel? Is one thing, and that is what I think the international community has been pushing for. Or do you want to keep pushing and annexing land and doing what the current Israeli government is doing, and really kind of forcing the one-state solution at the end? And that is not good for the Israelis themselves, as some people would say. And it's not, I don't think the Palestinians also want it, although some of them might want that as well. As long as you can have a solution whereby the 6 million people are treated as humans and have a nationality of a country, and they have rights and obligations, then I think the Palestinians are going to accept that. I think it's the ball is in the Israeli court, as it were, to decide what do they want. And unfortunately, with the current government doesn't want to do either, and it's very making it even more complex and making definitely the two-state solution almost impossible, and pushing it further towards the one-state solution or stateless people. And that is wrong. And I think it is a very, as I said earlier on, it's a very complex situation, and it is not going to go overnight. And I don't think this even peace agreement, with whatever it entails, with the UAE, is going to sort the core issue, the core problem. And I feel like I can get into that later on in my presentation.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Let's hear from Rabbi David Rawson on his views on this as well, on these questions.
Thank you. Well, if you'd like to hear my response concerning the Palestinians, I think I'm the only one on the call who's actually living amongst the Palestinians. So I can tell you that despite the rhetoric generally of senior-aged intellectuals who will tell you that the Palestinian population is reflected by Abu Mazen and by Hamas in terms of the rejectionists, that is not the case at all on the street. I think the vast majority of Palestinians are just fed up with their leadership, whether it's the PA, whether it's Abu Mazen, whether it's Hamas. They see them all as corrupt. Their infighting and incapacities to come together is what causes the distress. Most Palestinians feel that the Second Intifada failed them because it persuaded Israelis that there isn't a partner for peace, and therefore all the opportunities that were there were lost, and that they are ultimately the victims of their own leadership. In fact, I'm surprised at how many Palestinians see the UAE-Israel Accord in a positive light, and out of total frustration with their own leadership, are hopeful that influences from the Gulf might be able to improve their lot and the conditions of their life. There's a feeling amongst the Palestinian street that Abu Mazen's rejection of Olmert was a big mistake, that violence all the time only is counterproductive, and that Israelis are more, in fact, intransigent, which is the case, precisely as a reaction to this reaction. And proof of the fact is that 20% of Israeli society are Arab Muslims who have full citizen rights. And therefore, the idea of apartheid is rather a silly concept when you look at that reality in terms of what Israel is. But I would say that Palestinians are very frustrated with essentially traditional Arab policy, and are hopeful that there might be a new horizon here. And I'm hopeful that there might be a new horizon which will alleviate the Palestinian situation, because their present leadership is not capable of delivering that for them. And that's a great tragedy for them. I certainly believe a two-state solution is still feasible. But even if we come to a situation where we have some kind of cantonized structure, that would be the case. The vast majority of Israelis want a strong Jordan, they want a strong Egypt, they want neighbors which they can rely on. And the result of the Abraham Accord has given people some kind of optimism, and I think even amongst Palestinian society.
Thank you, Rabbi David. Do we have any further comments from Sigurd and Dr. Shafiq before we move on to the 10-minute statement by Dr. Babood? Anything you would like to add from?
I'll just add one point, and that is that even the UAE, in how it presented its peace or normalization process with Israel, framed its cooperation with Israel as beneficial to the Palestinians. We see that Qatar, Oman, is also framing its engagement with Israel as supportive of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. And I think that illustrates that even if, as our friend Dr. Abdullah said, even if the Palestinian issue is an important issue, it's not the only issue anymore, but it is certainly the issue that the various governments present to justify their own strategic cooperation with Israel. And I think that that's very important to understand. And my own view is that the Abrahamic Accord actually left the door open for a two-state solution precisely because it took annexation off the table. Whether or not that will entice the Israelis and the Palestinians to engage in direct negotiations, we don't know yet. But I will say that from that point of view, it was a positive step, even if there can be many misgivings about how the UAE operates as a regional actor and how it operates with its own Arab neighbors. And there are lots of question marks around that. When it comes to the narrow focus on preventing annexation, I think that's a positive aspect going forward for revitalizing any efforts to bring the two-state solution alive.
Thank you. Dr. Shafiq, any last comments?
Yes, we'd like to. I will comment on the Rabbi's comment as well, if that is okay. Is that, the Rabbi lived in South Africa, knows what apartheid is, lived in Ireland, knows what conflict is, has a background, I think was born in the UK, right? And maybe you have activated the law of return to come back to what you consider your country, while a Palestinian who was born in Palestine and is in exile now cannot activate the law of return to go back to any part or section of Palestine, cannot even visit it. It's an irony. And I know you know the sufferings of others. I know you live, you talk, but it's very hard for you to be able to talk on behalf of the Palestinians in such a complex situation. I know there are Palestinians who are critical of the authority or critical of Hamas, but this is their leadership. It's like there are many Israelis who are critical of Netanyahu. He happens to be the leader of the Israelis at this point, right-wing, problematic. You may have a prime minister from the extreme right, which I think rising several parties that today have that potential. Nobody will choose anybody's leader for them. yes, Abu Mazen is legitimate for Palestinians, despite the difficulty. The economy is extremely difficult in the West Bank. It's totally Israeli controlled. It's totally export-import, normal life, the settlements. I mean, 60% of the land is not really under Palestinian control. You cannot build a viable situation. Yet Palestinians will build something, will manage. They exist. They will. Their nationalism is solid. And therefore, yes, many Palestinians will respect all the Arab countries, including the UAE, but it doesn't mean they agree with this agreement. They feel it's let them down. But at the same time, they realize that they're not happy with the division between Hamas and Fatah. So Hamas is there, Fatah is there. There'll be new ones coming, like in every situation. The young generations want to live in peace, but they want to live with justice, respect, dignity, aspirations. I mean, you can't be thrown from your home in East Jerusalem because you happen to be an Arab. You can't be 20% of the population in proper Israel, the quote-unquote only democracy, but not really the only democracy. It's a democracy for an ethnic group. Judaism, Jews who have created an Israeli nationality. And I do see the Israeli nationality being created in the process. But what's the situation? You are a Muslim in a Zionist Jewish state that has the nationality law that tells you're not really, and that's problematic. One day this will have to change, and it will only happen when marginalized people raise their voice. Even in the USA, marginalized people are raising their voice regarding equality, discrimination, what happened in Minnesota in the beginning. I mean, that's in the USA, which has a much better, much more amazing, positive human rights record, relatively speaking, when you compare it with Israel. Israel doesn't have a positive human rights record, given the way it has treated the indigenous population over the years. And it's not true. Abu Mazen rejected. That's not true. There was never a real offer to the Palestinians along the lines of the June 4th borders, by which the Palestinians agreed after a long suffering and a long way to partition in that context. There was never a real offer. No, neither in Camp David with President Clinton, never. Read Bob Malley, read Hussein Agha, read other members who were there. You will see it was much more controversial, and it was always, you see, the US has always had a blind eye towards Israel. That has been a problem, and with this administration in particular, we have the lowest trust. I mean, there is not only a blind eye; it's all the eyes are blind. With Mr. Kushner and with the President Trump, it's a one-sided, and you cannot be a broker. You cannot even be an acceptable broker to produce peace when you are one-sided. It will not work. You can have a wishful thinking about it working, but it will not work. So we are. In this, Palestinians genuinely want to see an end to the apartheid and forget the leadership. Let's talk about the base. Let's talk about Maslow's needs. Let's talk about human suffering. Let's talk about what people want. They want to travel. They want to live normal. They want to go and come. But they want political rights. They also want human civil rights. They want all their rights. They don't want their prisoners thrown for ages, strike after strike, 6,000 of them in Israeli jails. It's not today. There is no Israeli de Klerk. And you're telling me maybe there is no Palestinian Mandela, but I will tell you that President Abbas and even Hamas, you've been negotiating with Hamas all along between all these wars, between 2008 and 2014. There has been on these ceasefire. I mean, war is maybe negotiation in a different way, but at least people have been able to come to grips into the limits of militarism and military. And that's where you had in the Gaza Strip under siege, under human conditions that are, you are not estimating the time bomb in Gaza. You are not estimating the suffering of people in Gaza to the point where there are now 2 generations that are not even in a normal situation, under total siege, can travel, can go, can see the world, can manage. I mean, we're lucky there is the social media, but besides that, they are totally encircled. And yet,
thank you, Dr. Shafiq.
I'm not here to debate the Palestinian issue with you. Obviously, I disagree with almost everything you said. I was asked simply whether the Palestinians, what the Palestinian attitude was. And I would tell you the Palestinian attitude is not that of Abu Mazen and of Hamas. And with regards to the suffering and the desire to resolution, the vast majority of Israelis would like to do that. They're suffering too. You completely ignore, therefore, the dimension of it. There's a situation to resolve, but it's not a question of apartheid. Apartheid is when you deny people their civil liberties on the basis of the color of their skin. Here, this is a security issue, where Israel is proven by the fact that its citizens have full rights regardless of race, color, creed. But the situation with regards to the West Bank and Gaza is totally different. Why? Why is it totally different from the situation with regards to the Arabs within Israeli society? Because it's not an apartheid issue. It's an issue to do with security and threat and perceptions of their own particular viability. So you can criticize Israel policy. You can say it's wrong, perfectly legitimate to do so. But it's not coming out of a desire to oppress people because of the color of the skin or their ethnicity or their religion. That's why the term is wrong.
Thank you. Thank you both. For the interest of time, let us
allow me one sentence. I mean, Rabbi David, look into it. It's not about the color of the skin. We are colored in a certain way. We are third world. We are Muslims and Arabs and Christians in the Holy Land, and we've been treated in the way any colonial settler would treat people.
There are more Israeli blacks than there are Palestinians.
Read all the books, Israeli books. Read Tom Segev, even.
Okay, thank you both. I think we can agree to disagree for now. In the interest of time, we will move to Dr. Babout's 10-minute comment. Dr. Babout, if I could ask you, based on the UAE-Israel deal that we had been talking about, could you tell us a bit about the reactions by Oman, Bahrain, and Qatar, considering each has their own relationship with Israel? What are the perceptions at the state and local levels? I know we talked a bit about this being an emotive issue, but what is your general assessment of what's going on between what is the people in government and the people on the ground? Please, Dr. Babout, you have the floor.
Thank you, Clemens. I was actually interested in hearing the debate between the Rabbi and Shafiq, but if you ask me to speak about this, I want to start by just dispelling some of the misperceptions, if you like, that we all hold at different sides of this conflict. One of those perceptions is that the Arabs, the Muslims hate the Jews or the Israelis. And I think that perception has to be debated as well. And they don't want to accept Israel. I think that is also wrong. One other misperception is that because of my own security, I don't care about the others. And I don't care about human rights, and I don't care about what, international rights, etc., and other humanities. The other perception is that, might is right. And as long as I am strong and powerful, and I've got the United States support behind me, I can do whatever I want. And, those perceptions, misperceptions, and there are many, I won't get into them all, do actually kind of color the picture. Just to correct a few things is that the Arabs have already, all the Arab countries have already accepted the state of Israel. And the Arab Peace Plan in 2002, with all its positives and negatives, have been put there, which basically says, we will accept Israel, we want to have normalization with Israel in all aspects, as long as there is, of course, if they meet, certain international agreed principles. Now we can discuss those details, but the principle is that it's already there. It's been accepted. And there is no problem between an Arab and Israeli, a Jewish and Muslim, or Jewish and Christian Arab. There is no problem with the race itself or the religion itself. There is a problem with the Israeli policies. And that is really what we really need talking about. And again, in a way to answer to what Rabbi David had mentioned is that, you know, there is no one people, or there are no people who just blindly follow their own government or like their own government. I mean, look at the United States and look how the population in the United States, and look how they look at Donald Trump and Israel itself. And Mahmoud Abbas or Ismail Haniyeh are not necessarily different from that. They have their own faults. What we are talking about is the people in the region. The people in the region now have had enough conflicts, have had enough wars and devastating relationships that are affecting the whole region from east to west. People want to live together. They want to trade. They want to travel. The Israelis want to be part of this region, and the Arabs want to be also, you know, be able to go to Israel and visit Palestine, etc. So there is this aspiration of the people. Is that where we really need to think about? We need a paradigm shift in the way that we think about the conflict, and the way that we think that, you know, our security is guaranteed. There is no country that is secured in the world more than Israel, with all its arsenal of equipment and, you know, weapons, etc. And I don't think all the Arab countries and the Muslim countries combined can even, you know, create a threat to Israel. And that is already accepted. Israel is already the only nuclear power in the region. What people want is the right for the Palestinians. What are their rights? What is Israel going to accept? And I think if there was anything that was given to the Palestinian leadership that is meaningful, I think any leadership, not only the Palestinian leadership, would bite the hands that gives them that. But nothing was given substantially or reasonably to allow that. That's not to say that, you know, there are problems with the Palestinian leadership. Obviously there is, and we all accept that. I even tweeted about it last night. You know, how bad is that the Palestinian leadership is. And now I want to move to the topic that you that you asked me, having just clarified this. I think what is going on, and especially the Abraham Accord, any peace, any movement towards peace is obviously welcome. But however, we need to understand whether this is really going to help peace, or is it just a tactical game for the benefit of one party or the other. And it could actually have the wrong consequences, if you like. United Arab Emirates and Israel are not at a war. There are no Gulf countries at a war with Israel. And there are already many relationships at my friend and colleague, Sigon Nibord had just explained in his book and his presentation. The relationship goes back to the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. It's clandestine, it's under the table, some of it at least, but some of it was over the table, and there have been meetings, and during and official meetings and visits, and after the Oslo Accord and the Madrid process, you saw that there were, visits by Israeli Prime Minister to the region, and until recently to Oman. And even trade offices hoping to open embassies were opened. And there were signals to Israelis, to the Israeli public, to the Israeli government, that look, we want peace and we mean it. We just move on this process. Unfortunately, for one reason or the other, it hasn't moved on, and it all under the guise of Israeli security, which it doesn't bite anymore, unfortunately, with all respect. Now, what happened with the Abraham Accord is basically, you know, you can call it a peace process, you could call it a peace agreement, and as I said, the two countries are not at war, so it's a misnomer to call it a peace process. It is a marriage of convenience for what Israel wants to have a breakthrough in its relationship, especially the current government, breakthrough with its relationship with Arab countries, so the Netanyahu can, you know, say, look, you know, I've done it. And it's the United Arab Emirates that wants, you know, sees it has a different role than, or a major role that it wants to play in the region, in a region that is at the moment in a state of flux, in a region that are really kind of plagued by conflicts, etc. And there is a vacuum in the region in terms of leadership, with Saudi Arabia not being the kind of the traditional leader that it used to be. Egypt has lost its leadership role, etc. So, and the United States, there is a talk about this, you know, quote unquote withdrawal from the region, etc. So there's a vacuum in the region. And the United Arab Emirates thinks that it can actually fill in that region. And because of that vacuum, we have seen countries like Iran having its, if you like, influence in the region. We've seen countries like Turkey coming into the region. And now we are seeing Israel kind of an alliance with the United Arab Emirates under the, you know, the rubric of the Abraham Accord. And I kind of wonder if this is really going to help peace. I hope it does. And it'll be great if it did. It might push the Palestinians more towards reconciliating their own differences. Whether that will, you know, push them towards peace or make them more, if you like, stronger. That's for the future to tell. But it is, you know, the involvement of Israel in the region, especially in the Gulf, could actually complicate the already muddied picture. You know, as I said, we already have lots of regional powers, and here is another regional power becoming much more entangled. And it could be devastating, in fact, for Israel as well. Because I think the last thing Israel wants to do is you know, go on beyond its borders and get trapped into other regional conflicts in the region. It has enough on its plate, as it were. But in this kind of very muddied, if you like, regional alliances that are being built one way or the other, the United States pushing for one direction or the other, we've seen that Israel is now coming in, adding another dimension to the situation. And one can understand what the United Arab Emirates has done. It wants a strong partner. Israel is a very important regional, strong, militarily, technologically, in terms of science and technology, etc., and security. It could see that this is, you know, it's something that it could help me. There is, as my friend and colleague Sigurd had also mentioned, this, it helps the inter-Gulf rivalry that is taking place between all the members of the Gulf states in one way or the other. And it was aptly described by Sige earlier on. So it sees that it has created an alliance or a very strong ally that it could help it in this kind of rivalry on one hand, but it could also, again, as explained by Sigi, it helps it in its relationship in Washington, D.C. That maybe is the real reason. If there was a secondary, if you like, reason for this, which is the peace, that would be welcome. But I don't think that is the issue, and I don't think the Palestinians, either the leadership or the public in general, from what we see, have welcomed this. Now, when it comes to the regional countries, as I said earlier, you know, they already had a relationship with Israel. Apart from Kuwait, all the Gulf states have that. one way or the other at different levels, and they have cooperation with Israel. You know, that cannot be denied. Now, we've seen that the euphoria that initially came up after the signing or the announcement of the peace process has actually died down. Even in Saudi Arabia, that opened its borders, if you like, our airspace for the Israeli plane to fly over, they kept saying that it had to be a comprehensive peace and it has to relate to the Arab peace plan. So they have not thrown their, if you like, their weight with it. Although one can say that perhaps, you know, they're waiting for the right moment. And I think this goes for all the Arab Gulf states. They are waiting to see what kind of consequence this is going to happen. Even Bahrain and Oman that initially supported the Abraham Accord, they actually now slowed down. And basically the last announcement that they are supporting the Arab peace plan. So I think it's very difficult to tell where is this going to go. I think there is a test or the United Arab Emirates is taking this test to see how the public reaction, how regional reaction is going to be. And I can tell you from what I hear, it's mixed, but I think it's mainly against the deal because they don't see it as really pushing towards peace. If you cannot sort out the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and you know the issue about stopping Israel and annexing the land is debatable. Whether Netanyahu is going to go for that or not is also was debatable. But it does not say anything about Palestinian rights. It does say anything about you know, Palestinian state, etc. So the public opinion in general, although you know there are no public opinion polls here that one can rely on, but from what you hear in the media and so on, I think the people are totally against the deal because they don't see it as a means to pushing the peace. And the peace, if it comes, will be byproduct and it'll be just another thing another outcome that wasn't planned. So yes, I think in Bahrain, in Qatar, and Oman in general, there was, especially in Bahrain and Oman, they were initially kind of a support for it, but it died down because the public are against it, and I think the region is still against it. And I think this is, you know, it does not really offer anything that is suitable. For Israel, you know, they can show that this is, they have been able to, a real breakthrough for the Netanyahu government that he can be proud of, and to say that, look, I see what I've done, my policies are right, I can do whatever I want to the Palestinians, the Arabs don't care, and I've just, you know, signed a peace and the others are coming online. I think that is wrong. I think it's just, you know, going the wrong way. And I will conclude by saying, if I allow me, Clemens, by saying everybody wants peace. I think we are all sick and tired of this. We all want peace and security and stability and prosperity in the region. And that can only come through peace. And we want to coexist. We want to live together. We want to trade. We want to mix with each other. And there is no like inherited hatred within the people. But there is one issue that we cannot ignore, however we want to ignore it, and that is the plight of the Palestinian people. Unless that is resolved, you know, all these tactical moves here or there are not going to help the situation. I hope they do, but I don't think so. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah Babood. Just to add on to your earlier comment about the public opinion, I have with me sort of a summary of Middle East public opinion poll done by Dr. James Zogby, of the president of the Arab American Institute. And he conducted a poll in 2018 where about the feelings of citizens feelings by citizens in Saudi Arabia and the UAE about the Palestinian issue. And it seems that roughly 60% of respondents in both countries said they oppose partnering with Israel against Iran, even if Israel ends the occupation and signs a peace deal with the Palestinians. So it's sort of a statistic that we have here. But let us now invite Rabbi David Rawson to give his 5 to 10 minutes remarks. Could you comment on the degree of cooperation in the Gulf with Jewish communities and how that plays into informal relations with Israel? Of course, we've seen how religious inclusiveness has been a theme. And one prime example is Pope Francis' landmark visit to the UAE, and following which the UAE's decision to establish an interfaith council known as the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity. So will we see this trend continuing, and how can interfaith relations spill over into more formal forms of diplomacy? We've also seen that Israel scored 2 diplomatic gains when majority Muslim Kosovo agreed to recognize Israel, and also we've seen how Serbia has said that it would move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Both are US brokered deals, by the way, but just to get your views on these and your comments. Thank you.
I will indeed, but I think your comment immediately after Dr. Abdullah finished was important. You noted the survey that showed that regardless of whether Israel establishes a peace treaty with the Palestinians, there is still hostility and there's still opposition. So you have confirmed that with your data. Now that's really important because Dr. Abdullah's own particular view may be very noble and very positive, but I think he has a rather generous view of the Arab world as a whole. Between from December 2008 to 2001 to 2019, one of the most important hate monitoring organizations went to book fairs in Doha, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait City, Muscat, Jeddah, and Cairo. In every single one of these instances, they found numerous examples of anti-Semitic books through online platforms and apparently on site as well. They included Hitler's Mein Kampf, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the International Jew, and even copies of Mein Kampf and International Jew were listed in the catalogue under children's books. I mean, we can go on with this. It is absolutely naive at best to conclude that there is no anti-Semitism and hostility towards as Jews qua Jews within the Arab world and within the Gulf as a whole. Now, you could say, and I think that's a legitimate argument, that were it not to be for the political conflicts, this might have not erupted. And maybe 100 years ago it was different. Even then, I think that's deluding ourselves, because even though the condition of Jews was much better under Islam than it was under Christianity, Jews still had to know their place. And the perception of the Jew as devious, as suspicious, as somebody untrustworthy, all the negative stereotypes prevail. And I encounter it when I travel within the Arab Muslim world, and I travel extensively. Now, I think that the UAE-Israel Accord is really significant in terms of changing those perceptions. We will see more tourism, more cooperation. We will overcome those stereotypes and negative perceptions, and I believe that will redound also to Palestinians' advantage. But it's simply not true to say our only problem is with Israel and we love Jews. In fact, look at now Sudais of the mosque in Saudi Arabia, who it didn't even refer specifically to the Abraham Accord, but simply referred to some positive attitudes of the Prophet towards Jews. He received incredible vitriol and condemnation for preparing the way for some kind of reconciliation with Israel. And if you look online and you see what kind of language was used against him, let alone against Jews, it's what you would call anti-Semitic. So I think there is something far more serious that needs to be addressed than simply to pass it away and say, we love Jews, they're fine, it's only Israel we have a problem with. At any rate, now getting specifically to what you asked me to address, interfaith initiatives tend to come first and foremost from minorities who want to be understood and accepted by a majority. And sometimes you have within civil society, which is not widespread within the Arab world, and indeed not widespread perhaps throughout the whole of the world, but there are civil societies where people want to advocate for tolerance and for social cohesion, and therefore they will see interfaith relations as an important vehicle in order to advocate for that. But it requires a certain amount of self-confidence and curiosity, and this has not generally been forthcoming. The engagement with Jews on the part of Arab Muslim countries has been primarily within the framework of broader interfaith involvement in the wake of September the 11th, 2001. And the consequences of the emergence of Al-Qaeda and of radical extremism were of course very serious, first and foremost for the image of the Arab Muslim world, and a recognition that there was a need to be able to address this image problem. Of course, first and foremost, there had to be the question of counterterrorism, and these countries invested heavily in this, and you saw initiatives coming from the UAE like the Hadaya program and others in terms of counterterrorism, but an understanding that there was a need to be able to reach out and interfaith for a few reasons. First of all, to deal with the image issue. Secondly of all, to be able to advance the leverage of soft power, recognizing not everything is in hard power. There was also a need to be able to find alliances with the West. There is this myth that Jews have some disproportionate influence, and therefore a good relationship with Jews can help that. But the relationship was not necessarily specifically bilateral. It was more within a broader interfaith initiative. And there you had this amazing move of the late King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz from Saudi Arabia in terms of this whole initiative for interfaith dialogue that he initiated in 2004, I think it was, that he began this particular direction. And the UAE came in a little bit later. It wasn't really till 2014 that they founded, with the leadership of Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayer, this Forum for the Promotion of Peace in Muslim Lands, and then their important Marrakesh Charter that in 2016 based upon the Charter of Mecca of the Prophet Muhammad, and then the Alliance of Virtue. There are now 3 different ministries in the UAE working in the interfaith scene, and this involves the Jewish community very significantly. Is a Jewish community a specific goal of these interfaith initiatives? It's certainly one of them. It's not the only goal, but it's certainly one of them. And there have been more and more Jewish involvement. There's many more rabbis, scholars participating in interfaith colloquia and meetings in the UAE. You may know that I, just before COVID broke out, I was the first rabbi and certainly the first Israeli to be invited by Saudi Arabia and to meet with King Salman, within the context of an interfaith framework. In other words, it's not specifically because I'm from Israel. It's, however, the fact that I am from Israel and that I am a rabbi does not disqualify me. That's a big change. And that is a reflection, as I say, of the factors I mentioned before, and of also a recognition and a desire, whether it was in Saudi Arabia at its own pace, but in the UAE at a much more rapid pace, that there is a need to change attitudes within the country. And even what I was referring to before about the rampant anti-Semitism as a result of the conflict over the last 100 years has to be addressed too. And that the more there is engagement with the Jews, the more positive this will impact internally on society. There's also recognition that anti-Semitism is the most dangerous label in terms of their global interests. And if they can be seen countries to have a positive attitude towards Jews, this will help their image as well. In other words, all these things come together. And I think, therefore, not for nothing was the accord called the Abraham Accord. There is a recognition that the interfaith relationship, and specifically the bilateral interfaith relationship, which will now flourish far more extensively, is really important in providing, if you like, again, the soft context and support for political and diplomatic initiatives. And I think we'll see an increasing use of this dimension under with, if you like, the kind of rubric of Back to the Future, images of the past, constructive relationships between the Muslim and Jewish and Christian world. In fact, when we had this meeting with King Salman, he said something very interesting. He said, Islam is an open, embracing, and tolerant religion. We in Saudi Arabia were forced by political circumstances to become more insular and isolationist. We are now finding our way back to our original ethos. That's quite fascinating. Whether you accept this historical analysis or not doesn't matter. What matters is that this is the line that is coming out, and it's the line that Mohammed bin Zayed is also pushing through these different operations. As I mentioned, the one through the Forum for Peace in Arab, through Abdullah bin Bayer, now the head of the Supreme Fatwa Council, the Interfaith Action Council, which deals with combating hate and promoting child welfare in the digital age, coming out of the UAE Ministry Interior, as well as a Ministry of Tolerance, which of course had the Year of Tolerance, and with regards to the papal visit, and the establishing now of the House of Abraham, where they will be building for the first time, at least in recent memory, a new synagogue within the Arab Muslim world, together with a church and a mosque in Abu Dhabi. This, of course, is symbolic. But symbolism is very significant here. And that symbolism is essentially the constructive use of religion to create an atmosphere at which diplomatic understanding, collaboration, and cooperation is made more feasible.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi David, for your comments. So we will be open for Q&A. So please do send us your questions through the chat box. Let me just start with 2 questions, and I will probably go back to Sigurd here so that he could address these 2 questions first, and also touching on the fact that Rabbi David mentioned the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The first question is, could you tell us if the UAE-Israel deal has allowed the UAE to reinforce its international profile as a forward-looking Arab state from Washington's eyes? So from Washington's point of view. And the second question, what next for Saudi Arabia? Of course, it was the one who launched the API back then. But what next? When we talk about this Abraham Accord, would they? I mean, of course, Prince Turki and King Salman have reaffirmed its support for the Palestinian cause. But what next? So I have these 2 questions that we'll probably run through the panel, and we'll start with Sigurd. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that question. I think it's important to recognize that this is not a zero-sum conversation, whereas Rabbi David is, of course, correct about all the positive aspects related to Jewish engagement with the United Arab Emirates. And I think that there is a genuine interest, not just in the UAE, but across the Gulf. There's a genuine interest in Jewish issues, whether it's culture, whether it's exchange, or whether it's geopolitics. I think that is true, and it's something that is growing. So this is not where the criticism of the United Arab Emirates comes in. Where the criticism of the United Arab Emirates comes in Washington is transfer of advanced weaponry obtained from the United States to various militias operating in Yemen and in Libya. It is about the blockade of Qatar, which of course complicated President Trump's regional agenda, which was to form a unified Arab Islamic bloc against Iran, to pressure Iran to come to the negotiations table and negotiate the JCPOA. So the United States has spent almost 4 years trying to resolve this inter-Gulf dispute. And it's important to understand that the military threat against Qatar was real. It was not imagined. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia had tried to invade Qatar, and dragging in pro-Israel groups into this inter-Arab struggle was extraordinarily destabilizing from an American perspective. So I think that these are the issues, the reasons that the United Arab Emirates faced significant pushback and anger, if you will, in Washington, including in the Trump administration. So by normalizing relations with Israel, it is getting back on its feet, and it gets to have a positive image in the international public opinion. Forget about people who are engaging in political motivated criticism of the agreement, whether it's good or not. But I think that's the hard geopolitical aspect of it. When it comes to inter-Jewish dialogue in the Gulf, I think that's positive. I think that people who want to have dialogue should move forward. I think that one cannot be beholden to negative voices negative criticism. But I think that we have to look at the broader shift taking place in the Gulf, and diplomacy and inter-Arab struggles cannot just be ignored while we're celebrating the UAE Israel normalization process. The inter-Arab struggles are, unfortunately, the other side of that coin. And I do think that, and going back to my initial point, I think that Israel has responded to these changes in a responsible manner, understanding fully well what is transpiring in the Gulf, and that there is potential great power rivalry in the Gulf, and to ensure that the Gulf maintains its cohesion within the tremendous difficult environment that is there, and at the same time leaving the door open for inter-Palestinian Israeli peace talks. So all of these things are complicating the situations, but I do think that one point that is very important to emphasize, and maybe my friend Shafiq will disagree with this, but within the Gulf arena, Israel is the only non-Gulf actor that is acceptable to both sides of the GCC dispute. Turkey and Iran, for the obvious reasons, are not. And Israel, because it has played a stabilizing role, it's just a partner that one has to embrace. It's a difficult one to embrace for the reasons that we discussed, because of the unresolved Palestinian issue. But it is a party in the Gulf dispute. It is a party that the various Gulf countries have to deal with. But to just focus on the positive aspects of the UAE-Israel deal is one thing. But I do think that the Israeli government understands quite clearly what is happening in the Gulf, and it is exercising its responsibility in that arena very cautiously. This is the first point. The second point I want to add is that it is the Trump administration that has really pushed Gulf-Israel ties for its own political purposes, as opposed to the Israelis driving that agenda. The Israelis have dealt with the ups and downs of Gulf-Israel ties for the past 30 plus years and understand the dynamics well. I think it is the Trump administration who would like to see as many quote unquote Gulf-Israel normalization deals as possible for their own political purposes, without necessarily taking a long view on how to build a lasting Arab-Israeli peace. And while these things fluctuate, I think that it's extremely positive that all of the Gulf states engage with the Jewish community and try to establish human-to-human relations that eventually will help the process moving forward to a lasting Arab-Israeli peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Shafiq, if you could unmute. Yeah.
Well, so many things have been said. I would definitely focus on that this agreement stands on the wrong leg, the wrong feet. It does not address any of the issues. Gulf countries are divided. The fact that some Gulf countries have agreed or looked at they are flexible is from too much US pressure. And I will warn that too much pressure on countries in the Arab world will backfire. And I guarantee you it will backfire at some point. It plays into the hands of Iran and Turkey as well. We have regional competitors who also speak about the question of Palestine. Both Turkey and Iran have a stake in that as well, given the situation as it evolved. I do understand that Israel once had a perfect relation with Turkey and a more perfect relation with Iran. And I see that today they don't have that. It's much less with Turkey, not like before, but it went to the opposite with Iran. And I remember when Israel was able to enter Lebanon, while many people in Lebanon then hoped that maybe the Israelis will rid them of the situation, particularly in South Lebanon. And I recall when the Israeli army entered, there were people who were maybe happy that this may end all wars and all situations. And how did the Israelis leave South Lebanon? With Hezbollah confronting them and liberating their land rightfully, like anybody liberating, like the French resistance liberated their land from Nazi occupation. So I want to tell you that the image of Israel in the region is that of a state that is a rouge state. It's a state that doesn't care about international law. It doesn't stand up in relation. It started with an original sin. You want to call this anti-Semitism? It is not. When you kick an entire nation, an entire population, that's anti-Arab, that's anti-Muslim, that's anti-native. It's not anti-Semitism. There is no anti-Semitism per se, unless we always talk about minorities have an issue always all over the world. I mean, you can say whites, anti-black, you can say Black Lives Matter, but you have created, according to Finkelstein, an industry called the Holocaust industry. So the Holocaust have happened. It's a disaster by all means in history. And but to be able to use it regularly in order to settle land that is not yours, to take rights that is not yours, to persecute people that you should not persecute, in order to force yourself on an entire land, regardless of any human value, that's what when I call apartheid and when I say occupation. And when I look at it and say, this explodes, this status quo cannot continue and will not continue given the situation. So yes, the image of Israel in the Arab world is tarnished. It's a negative one. And it has linked itself to a certain image regarding people, people will generalize, and I can see that, but at the same time, it's not anti-Judaism. That's not correct. But people have a very low opinion of the Israeli state because it started with an original sin. It never recognized that original sin. It never apologized. It never said yes for a law of return, partial, full, regulated, and agreed upon. It never agreed to a genuine Palestinian state. It weakened the Palestinian leadership that came with Arafat and then with Abu Mazen. As flexible as Abu Mazen is, it pushed the Palestinians to create Hamas. Hamas did not come out of a vacuum. It came out of realities of suffering, and it pushed Palestinians to create Hamas as much as it pushed Lebanese to create Hezbollah. I mean, so basically we're in a quagmire. That's not true. We're not, it's a very superficial to say things are okay. They are not okay because also we are in a region that when you mix with a certain category of autocrats, you will hear whatever they think. Does that reflect the reality? Yes, you've had a poll, but there is a poll by the Washington Institute here in Washington, D.C., which gives a solid, a different opinion, though it's the Washington Institute. It's more pro-Israel, and yet it was able to see that there is a big sizable proportion of the population, 70 and 80%, that has a negative view of this agreement and of the way Israel handles itself. So people are fed up with settlements, people are fed up with occupation, people are fed up with expansion, people are fed up with trying to destabilize Jordan, people are fed up and they feel Israel will try to destabilize the Gulf and will bring militarization of the Gulf with a small state that has a project 10 times its size. And it's going to be very hard to keep, to hold, to maintain.
Thank you, Dr. Shafiq. Dr. Babut, your comments, and also just to bring up the same two questions again on the UAE's, does it bring out the UAE's reinforced international profile as a forward-looking Arab state? And also, what next for Saudi Arabia since its launch of the API? Over to you.
Thank you. I had to change position because it was too warm in the other room. Right. I have one or two comments. I would agree with David about what he thought that there is some anti-Semitism in the Middle East or the Arab world. Although I wouldn't call it that way, but it's just a way of looking at it. I don't think this is in any way, if you like, strange, as much as we abhor that. But if you look at the Arab world, there is anti-Shia, anti-Sunni, anti-Turkish, anti-Ottoman, anti-Indians, anti-everything. It is a nature of things that we need to kind of grapple with and deal with, and it's obviously dying over time. There is also a problem that we conflate anti-Israel with anti-Jewish, and sometimes they use Jewish instead of Israel or Israelis, and I don't think that is intended. It's just like it is how that the culture is. And of course, we need to confront those kind of things, and we need to talk about it, and we need to sort it out. Equally, there is anti-Arab within the Israeli public opinion, within the Israeli culture as well, and that has also to be sorted out. As I said, it's not just singling out the Israelis or the Jewish. There is anti-Christian. There is even within the Sunnis, there are different anti-Sunnis groups that talk about each other. And you just look at the textbooks of these that are published on this. It's amazing, and it's in one way it is not accepted, but that's the culture. But it's not. We shouldn't take that as that the Arabs are just basically anti-Jewish. You have to remember that there are Arab Jews, and there's Arab Israelis, and there are Arab Sunnis, and there are Arab Shias, and so on. So that is one thing, and it's unfortunate that they conflate Judaism or Jewish with Israelis in one way or the other. And I would, thought that the rabbi would be much more, if you like, attentive to this, because it is not just anti-Semitism. And, while we stand for, being anti-Semitism, we have to also remember that the Arabs are Semitic race themselves. And, they look at the Jews as cousins and, brothers at the same time.
Don't explain Mein Kampf or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion or the Eternal Jew. Those have got nothing to do with the Israeli context or conflict. This is material borrowed essentially from classical anti-Semitic sources. You don't have that with any other context.
But this is a global issue that has been used by political groups here or there, and I'm not denying it exists. I don't think we should deny these the wrongs in our societies. It does exist, but what I'm trying to say is that it's not just necessarily if you just want to kind of focus on anti-Semitism in the Middle East, I think you will find a lot.
I understand that there's a general issue of prejudice, but I think there is something specific with regards to anti-Semitism. It may have been exploited.
The Shia would say the same thing, and the Persians would say the same thing, and the Ottomans would say the same thing, and the Arabs would also say the same thing, and the Sunnis would say the same thing. So I think we need to move the debate beyond that, and it is up to the intelligent people around the world to be able to kind of guide this, and rather than stick to these, and the narratives of the people who carry hatred for anything. And I think that is something that we need to I just want to flag that up. But to answer my friend Clemens' question about the United Arab Emirates, yes, I think the United Arab Emirates thinks that it's going to gain from this in many ways. At one level, it gains a very strategic partner, a very important country in the Middle East, a powerful country with, and in terms of its defense equipment and its know-how and technology and investment, etc. And there's been talk about that. So that is at one level. At the other level, it also answers some of its, or helps its conflict within the region, whether it is with, Iran or Qatar or however you want to look at that, and it strengthens its if you like, its strategy of being the little Sparta, as it were, to have this powerful regional country as its ally. Given the fact that the United States is not doing the role that used to be in the past, and it sees that it needs allies. And as you see that the United Arab Emirates is extending its influence and its relations beyond the Gulf to the Horn, to the Arabian Gulf, to the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa, and to Eastern Mediterranean. And this is where Israel could become very strategic partner, very important strategic partner for it. But also it strengthened its image globally, especially within the United States. And whether Trump is re-elected or not, there is a bipartisan, of course, support for Israel and so on. And this is going to kind of bode well for the United Arab Emirates that has lost some of its initial, if you like, gains in the Washington circles at some point because of certain policies that it followed, including the conflict in the Gulf and its conflict with Qatar and its involvement in the war in Yemen. So this kind of rebalanced the relationship with Washington. I think we can see that this is going to happen. So from a united self, if you like, interest, they see this as a gain, and one can consider that as a gain, if you like. But my worry, my own personal worry, is that it could have some negative consequences. Not that I'm saying this that we're against peace. As I said earlier, everybody wants peace in the region. It's just because because it's precisely not framed as a way of to resolve the Palestinian question. Maybe it is to push the Palestinians into a situation where they just have to see that they have no other Arab support, and therefore they succumb. Maybe it works, but I don't think so. I think the Palestinians have taken a lot of pressure, and they're fighting for the very last thing that they can get, and even then they're not getting anything. And I don't think they're going to get anything from this. I think it needs not the United Arab Emirates, but needs a vision from Israel of how it sees its relationship with the Palestinians and also its relationship with the region. And if I may just say something here, if you allow me, Clemens, just to
yes, please,
to what our friend Rabbi David just mentioned about Sudais. Yes, I followed what Sudais had said, and I don't think the anti-Sudais is because that he's calling for accepting of the Jews. I think it is to do with the hypocrisy that this man has been propagating. Like a year or so ago, he was, speaking from, as you know, he's the Imam of the Haram in Mecca, and of course a very important man. And he was speaking badly about Israel and about the Jews. Again, here he's conflating Jews with Israel in one sense, and we have to give him that. And then he suddenly, switched because of pressure, and it's that hypocrisy that an imam like him, who should be, of course, calling for peace, of course, calling for coexistence, but not necessarily just moving with the winds, as it were. That's why people were against him. I even tweeted against him, saying, "Come on, you can't be saying this and that at the same time." Not rejecting what he's saying, but he is someone who is not trustworthy in the public, and therefore, it seems that Saudi Arabia although it doesn't want to, and this may answer your question about the role of Saudi Arabia, it doesn't want to jump into this. It's very careful. Saudi Arabia has a much more, if you like, important role to play than the United Arab Emirates, and it has a lot to lose from having direct public relationship with Israel, at least at the time being, without seeing there is anything in return for the Palestinian. It could lose its like privileged position in the Arab and the Muslim world. But it is indirectly supporting the deal and pushing Sudais to say that in Haram in Mecca is basically, people are reading this as this is a Saudi policy trying to prepare the ground for this. It's a wrong way of preparing people. It's not that people are against the Jews. People want peace. And that's what I hear, what I see everywhere. And as I explained in my earlier talk, that there were attempts by Oman, by Qatar, by Bahrain, even Saudi Arabia, and UAE, all of the Arab countries as well, and the Palestinians, they all want peace. But what kind of peace are we talking about? And are we really are we resolving the main issues? Are we skirting again around it? This is where the issues is. And I think, just getting Sudais as a face to do this, you're mixing religion with politics, and you're not doing justice to either. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Babu. I think we have two hands from the floor. I think in the interest of time, we have about 10 minutes or so. Let's unmute my colleague James Dorsey and also Dr. Amim Lufti. We'll start with James. Please, your question.
Clemens, not a question, but a comment, if you don't.
Sure.
And I think that the debate on anti-Semitism is a very important debate. And I actually think that David and Abdullah are not that far from each other. Fact of the matter is that racism, prejudice is something that's universal. It's not unique to the Arab world. But fact of the matter also is that in contrast to much of the rest of the world, what you saw, and I say this having lived across the Arab and the Muslim world and coming from an Arab Jewish background, what you saw in the Middle East or in parts of the Muslim world, as opposed to other parts of the world, that you had state-sanctioned or at least state-tolerated racism, including anti-Semitism. And that goes back to regimes that adopted sectarian policies. And what you don't see yet is the institutionalization of anti-discriminatory, anti-racist, anti-Semitic attitudes. And that's, I think, where the difference lies. But in a sense, and I think it's important to note that in many ways, Abdullah and David aren't that far apart.
Thank you, James. Amim?
Yeah, I have a question maybe for Mr. Bor or Abdullah. And my question is that do you think that this UAE rapprochement with Israel is a sign that they no longer feel that Islamic terrorism or global terrorism is as such a real threat? Because I asked this because one of the reasons that they had been hesitant, Mr. Bor brought this out, that these are old ties. But the reason that they were accepted right now, I'm wondering if it has to do with that they think that the reaction to it cannot come back to their shores anymore.
Okay, I believe that the question was directed at Sigrid, please.
Yes, look, we have seen that the Palestinian issue can easily be manipulated for political gain and for a geopolitical rivalry. And terrorism and extremism is very much part, unfortunately, of the Middle East, even if ISIS has been defeated and even if other independent terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda no longer, at least at this moment in time, has the capability to launch international scale attacks. But radicalism is there, and these groups will inevitably use the Palestinian issue to their advantage when the opportunity comes. I think what is different now, as opposed to in the 1990s, is that during the 1990s there was a genuine optimism that Arab-Israeli relations, that the Israeli-Palestinian peace process could transform the region for the better. You had Israeli leaders such as Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak and so forth, who genuinely, in my view, sought to negotiate with the Palestinians and sought to transform the region for the better. So there was a lot of optimism there, and the smaller Gulf state wanted to support that process. I think what is different now is that now it's hard politics, hard geopolitics that are playing out. The Trump administration is, as I said before, is conditioning its bilateral relationships with the Gulf states and how they deal with the Israelis. And you know, for small Gulf states to say no to the United States and to the security umbrella that they have relied on for so long is very difficult, because we have already seen what happens. I mean, let me give you an example. Oman, which I would argue is the Gulf country that has the closest and the most friendly ties to Israel. Oman has never embarrassed Israel the way that the other Gulf states have. But even Oman was frozen out and isolated from the Trump administration by its own Gulf Arab neighbors. And for Oman does not have the financial resources that the other GCC countries have. And yet what Oman had was something that was much more valuable, and that is that it has a genuine and strategic relationship with Israel, as opposed to paying lobbyists in Washington to advance its agenda and to tell everybody how tolerant they are, when in fact they're using that to further other geopolitical gains. That is something that Oman did not do. Oman does not have to engage in lobbying games in order to have a strategic partnership with Israel. And I think that that's something that distinguishes the Omani strategic thinking and how it has engaged consistently, and not just for short-term geopolitical opportunities. So I think that Oman really stands out as perhaps the only mature strategic actor in the Gulf. So this is the first point. And Oman does not need to normalize relations with Israel in order to maintain its strategic partnerships with the United States and Britain, whereas the others have needed to do that. So it was able to resist pressure from its immediate Arab neighbors because the relationship with Israel is so deep and it's so warm and it's so friendly. When it comes to terrorism, I think that and pushback against Israel in the region, I think that if you look at Turkey, for instance, Turkey is now playing the anti-Israel rhetorically, but I think it's also understood that below the surface, should the leadership in Turkey change, I think that Turkish-Israeli relations could again flourish. I think that there's a lot of support in Turkey for a robust relationship with Israel, and right now the tensions between Turkey and Israel is very much between Erdogan and Netanyahu. It's on the leadership level. On the Iranian front, I think that Iran could eventually modify its position towards Israel. They're not going to do that for free. Iran is a rational geopolitical actor. We have seen it in terms of how it dealt with the JCPOA and the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from it. But I do think that also historical ties between the Jewish people and Persia, they go back thousands of years. As a matter of fact, I named my son Cyrus after the great Persian emperor. And in my limited engagement with Iranian officials, I have talked about the Jewish-Persian friendship, and that's something that they understand. Obviously, that's something that they reject at this moment in time, but I think that will eventually return. because of the deep historical ties between Jews and Persians. So what I think is the clear answer, or not the clear answer, but my own view is that Israel-Gulf relations will move forward, and incremental progress will be made, but the Palestinians can never be left out of the equation, because ultimately there will be attempts by other geopolitical actors to use the Palestinian card for their own political gain. And unfortunately, as long as there is geopolitical rivalry in the Middle East, Israel will find itself in the middle of many of these inter-regional struggles.
Thank you, Sigurd. Let's end off with one question, and I'll leave 1 or 2 minutes for each speaker to comment on this. We have one last question from the floor: is how sustainable is this normalization when we consider the geographical location and geostrategic importance of Egypt and Jordan, which signed peace treaties in 1979 and 1994 respectively? Both are in close proximity to Israel, but here the geographical factor is not the issue for the UAE. So how sustainable is this? We'll start with 1 or 2 minutes. I think we'll work the other way. We'll start with Rabbi David, please.
Well, I suppose the simple answer to that is sustainable as the parties want it to be. We do not live in an area, part of the world that is renowned for sustainability. We all live in an area, every single country and everyone represented here has serious human rights problems in those countries. Trying to point the finger at one as if it's somehow worse than the others is disingenuous at best. Every country faces the possibilities of insurrection. Obviously, the more democratic you are, the less likely you are, but nevertheless, insurrection is always a possibility. So you never know in any situation how sustainable it is. However, I think that this relationship, I would like it to be driven by the areas that I'm concerned primarily with: interfaith respect, human rights, human dignity. I would love it if such things are. But what treaty in the world and what agreement is really motivated by such values? In the world of realpolitik, there have to be pragmatic interests. And the pragmatic interests here are obvious. They are strategic, they are security, they are financial, they are trade, they are tourism, all those things. And when those things are really there, then I don't think that this relationship is going to be moved. So I think not only is it going to be sustainable, I think it's going to be expandable. I think it will expand. And I believe it will ultimately be good for the Palestinians and the resolution of their plight.
Thank you. Dr. Babood.
Thank you. I hope that I agree with Rabbi David that I think this relationship could be useful for all parties, and I hope that it is and it become useful to both parties. And we need to move the peace process from where it is now to something much more tangible. I don't think we should, while saying that and maybe answering to some of the other questions, I don't think we should ignore that this is something that, yes, could help, yes, could move things forward, but it could have a blowback. And my fear is that if it doesn't tackle the main issue, and here the main issue is the Palestinian question, that has been used by so many parties, whether they are Arabs or non-Arabs, for all kinds of, if you like, of politics and reasons and policies in the region. At the moment, Iran uses, the Palestinian cause. We've seen now even Turkey is moving into that. And my fear, again, relating to Amim's earlier question, is that perhaps this will push more towards radicalization instead of, more reconciliation. It will give the radical groups more if you like, food on the table to be able to use. And as we are seeing that the Middle East is not moving towards democracy, it's not moving towards human rights, and it is not, it's not moving towards political participation, and there is a fight against it, and Israel is going to be seen that it is actually getting itself muddled into all these other conflicts, which will add more fuel to what it's already there. That is my fear. And, and I agree with James that, this anti-Semitism is a structural issue. It's a big issue, and it needs to be settled. I think this could add more to the anti-Semitism. So they would see that these, if you like, oppressive regimes in the Middle East are supported by Israel, or these autocratic regimes are supported by Israel. And then, there is, we talk about human rights, et cetera, and then you have Palestinians who are deprived of it. This is where the problem is, unless the Palestinian issue is resolved. And that is not going to come from a peace process with a country far away from Israel. It comes with in a peace dialogue and a peace process between Israel and its immediate neighbors, and in particular, in this case, the Palestinians themselves. And the conflict there is very complex, as we know. It has historical, religious, ethnic, whatever you want to call it, issues. But no conflict is reconcilable if there was the goodwill to do so. And I hope that Israel would do so for the benefit of Israel, for the benefit of the Palestinians, and for the benefit of the region. Because without that, we are not sorting out the issues. I'm not saying that this is the cause of all the many issues, but it does actually poison the atmosphere. It poisons the situation. It feeds into the radicals, into their narratives. It increases antagonism against, of course, against democracy, etc., but against Israel and against the Jews. And we don't want that to happen. So I think we should think outside the box by trying to find out and think, critically about trying to find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian question, because that is the crux of the matter. This agreement could help, but it is a very remote way of doing it without facing the real dilemma on hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Babu. Dr. Shafiq, 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll have Sigurd to have the last say.
Well, in conclusion, I see that the main issue is structured, state-sponsored terror put on people. State-sponsored terror in the form that has persecuted the Palestinians for decades. It's in the recent book of Rashid Khalidi, the 100-year war, the 100-year conflict, the 100-year struggle. So going to an agreement with the UAE will not solve it. And looking for books in the Gulf that are in any way anti-Semitic is not the story. Anti-Semitism is not the issue. It's Israeli occupation and persecution of Arabs and Muslims and Christians and Palestinians on the ground. I read Protocols of Zionism, protocols of the protocols, but particularly that Russian document that has no author. When I was 16, I didn't believe a word in it. I realized since then that Zionism is not Judaism. I realized then that there are many Jews and even Israelis, and there were prominent Israelis even in the 1970s who spoke about Palestinian rights. So there was no issue here. It's not about the books. Actually, these books, I doubt so many people read them these days. Maturity in Arab public opinion has gone way ahead. But true, you go into the Twitter, into social media, you're going to see so many things that are basically controlled. There are certain types that have dominated Twitter, mostly ministries of information. So it's not about books. I can find any book in the USA. Nobody tells you not to read a book. You can read it and criticize it. So it's not about censorship. It's about realities on the ground. Who's losing, who's gaining, who's suffering, who's being marginalized, whose land is taken, whose life is being destroyed endlessly for young people all across. We can always blame so many, but it is clear there is a story with occupation, there is a story with settlements, there is another story with East Jerusalem, there is a story in Hebron, there is a story all over Palestine with Palestinians. And unless this is addressed seriously, genuinely, we will always be in a state of conflict. And yes, one day a regional coalition will have this impact and another regional coalition will have that impact. But I do realize that the future of the Arab world is with a democratic development, is with the ability to reflect people's aspirations. And when you go to people's aspirations, yes, they would like to see justice, and therefore justice is at the core. And I believe in Judaism, there is a lot of basis for justice, because when you look at Judaism, you look at the Talmud or the Torah, or you look at the Quran, or you look at the Bible, you can see phrases that you can interpret in a certain way that takes you to the extreme of extremes. And I realize how certain fundamentalists would use that from Jewish to Arab. But at the same time, I realize there are a lot of human values that we can build on, and that part of that is a commitment to justice, to equality, to respect, to dignity, to human life, in ways that can allow people to enjoy their being and to flourish in their countries, rather than take their land, take their country, and tell them, we've come here after 2,500 years, and now it's like we woke up suddenly, we're taking your land, you don't belong here. And these are populations that may have they have roots hundreds and thousands of years. In fact, some of the early Jewish settlers believed that many of the Muslims may originally have been Jews or non-Jews or whatever. But these are rights, and nobody should take these rights, no matter. Now, you tell me one state, you tell me two states, but not a Bandustan, not an apartheid, not discrimination, not third and fourth and fifth class citizens. We are in an era where people want to live with dignity, and we see it across the world, and it's coming back. Center, left of center, it's coming back. People don't want to be marginalized or put under a structure that behaves in a way that is extremely racist. I think this is, I don't care about an individual being a racist. I can debate racism with individuals. I can talk to anybody, and we can talk and take and give. But when state racism, as much as state terrorism, is at the core of things, then what kind of reaction do you expect from people? Some will react extremely in an extreme way. Some will react in a moderate way. Some will go all the way. I mean, people will not allow that structural racism to continue over their bodies and over their souls. And they also will not allow state terrorism to justify itself and then accuse them of being the anti-Semites, or accuse them of being anti-Israeli, or accuse them of being They are not. That is a result, probably, when it exists, of a situation on the ground, and we need to find a solution. Once we do, we will have a much better Middle East, and all peoples, including Israeli people, can be able to live in peace. But you cannot live with peace without justice, without rights, without humanity, without solving the inherent contradiction in the Zionist ideology, which has brought a lot of militarism to the Middle East and to the Arab world.
Thank you, Dr. Shafiq. And over to you to have the final word, Sigurd, and also how sustainable this deal is.
Well, I would like to look at the world in a positive manner, and there's no doubt about the extraordinary difficult geopolitical environment at this moment, and it could easily go in which you have great power competition on a global scale, and small power competition on a macro scale and a regional scale, as we're seeing in the Gulf. But what I do think this conversation is reflective of, despite the diversity of views that we've heard, is that Israel is part of the conversation in the Middle East. Israel is a fact of the Middle East. In my view, Israel is a peacemaker in inter-Arab disputes. the various Arab states has to deal with Israel one way or the other. And it is because, in my analysis, it's because Israel has demonstrated to be a reliable strategic partner. Even though there are many things one can criticize Israeli policies for, Israel has nonetheless demonstrated to be a reliable strategic partner, and it will continue to be so despite all the rhetoric that we're seeing, whether it's on social media or elsewhere. I do think that the moderate voices in the Gulf, and I would say that all the 6 GCC countries are moderate states supporting moderate policies abroad. And I reject firmly the politicization of inter-Arab Gulf disputes, framing one party as extremist and the other as moderate. I think that that's a politically motivated argument that has proven not to be the case. But I would say that it is really good and important that all of the GCC countries are finding ways in dealing with Israel. But it should not come at the expense of inter-Arab struggles. And certainly for countries that embrace tolerance abroad, that is positive, but it's less positive when they crack down on their own populations and selectively enforce human rights. And that's also part of the discussion, unfortunately. But I think every educated observer and every informed observer understand that. So I think that overall, I think many gains have been made. I think that discussions like these are extremely positive. It's extremely important to hear each other's narratives, even if we sometimes disagree with one another. And I think that more of these conversations will continue to take place, which hopefully over time will contribute to better understanding between Arabs, Jews, between Israelis and Arabs, and so forth. So I see this as a positive development, but at the same time, I think that it's really critical in terms of how the UAE Israel peace accord is managed and how that impacts inter-Arab dynamics. That's going to be a key factor, and we just don't know quite as of yet how that will play out. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sigurd. I think we've gone over the time by about 15 minutes, but let me conclude. To say that the UAE-Israel deal was also an assessment of risk and opportunity for all parties who were involved in the deal, and for the rest of the Gulf states, I think they have their own risk assessment to conduct in reviewing their ties with Israel, in reviewing the structural status quo that we talked about earlier, and in terms of the Palestinian issue, it remains a salient and emotive issue for Arabs, Gulf Arabs notwithstanding, and also an issue that is salient here in Southeast Asia among Southeast Asian Muslims, something that the Institute is going to examine as well. So with that, I would like to thank all the speakers for their invaluable comments in what has been a very forthright and fantastic discussion. And many thanks to the MEI events and publicity teams, and Kevin, of course, for putting this together and making it operational. I thank the audience as well for being here and listening to all the speakers attentively. And so thank you, everyone, and hope to see you again.
Thank you.